Press one note on a piano. Hold it down. Listen to it for a moment. On its own, that single note tells you almost nothing. It has no direction, no tension, and nowhere it wants to go. It is just a sound sitting in the air. Now, keeping that first note in your mind, press a second note alongside it. Something just happened. The moment those two pitches meet, your ear does something automatic and instant. It reaches out and measures the gap between them. You do not decide to do this, and you cannot switch it off. Your ear has been measuring these gaps your whole life, every time you have heard a song. That measured gap, that relationship between two pitches, is the single most important idea in all of music, and it has a name. It is called an interval. And here is the promise of this whole video. Get this one idea properly into your ear, really understand it, and chords, scales, melodies, and harmony all stop being a pile of disconnected facts you have to memorize. They turn into one connected picture. So let us build that picture from the ground up. So let us say it plainly, in one sentence you can hold on to. An interval is the distance between two pitches. That is the whole definition. There is nothing hidden behind it. One note is just a note, all on its own. But the moment you have two notes, they have a relationship, and that relationship, that distance, is the interval. Now here is why this matters so much, and why we are spending a whole video on it. Almost everything else in music theory is built directly on top of this one idea. Think about it. A chord is nothing more than a few intervals stacked on top of each other into a shape. A scale is a ladder of intervals climbing upward step by step, from the bottom to the top. And a melody is a path that walks and leaps from one interval to the next, the line you actually hum. So if you master the distance between two notes, you are not learning some small isolated fact. You are laying the foundation that every other idea in music rests on. Which brings us to the real question, the one the rest of this video answers. If an interval is a distance, then how do we actually measure it, and how do we give that measurement a name? Before we measure anything, there is one thing we have to clear up first, because it genuinely trips people up all the time. There are two completely different ways you can play any pair of notes, and we need to make sure they do not confuse you. The first way is to play them one after the other. First one note, then the other note, separated in time, the way a melody moves as it travels along. When you play an interval like that, in sequence, we call it a melodic interval. Melodic, like melody. The second way is to play both notes at exactly the same time, pressed down together, the way a chord sounds when it rings out. When you play an interval like that, stacked at once, we call it a harmonic interval. Harmonic, like harmony. Now here is the part that really matters, and the reason we are sorting this out so early. It is the same interval either way. The exact same two notes, the exact same distance between them, and the exact same name. Whether you spread them out in time or press them together, you have not changed the interval one bit. What you have changed is the texture, the feel, the color of the moment. But the underlying distance is identical. So from here on, whether the notes arrive one at a time or all at once, we are going to measure them in exactly the same way. Now for the measuring itself, and we are going to start with the part that is, honestly, the easiest piece of the whole puzzle. Every interval has a number, and that number tells you its rough size. A second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and so on. To find that number, all you do is count letter names, and there is exactly one rule you absolutely must not forget. You count the note you start on as 1. Not 0. 1. Let us do it together and see it happen. Start on C, and go up to G. Now say the letters out loud as you climb the keyboard. C is 1. D is 2. E is 3. F is 4. And G is 5. 5 letters, so this interval is a fifth. Simple as that. But look closely at what we just did, because this is where almost everyone slips. We counted C, the very note we began on, as number 1. We did not start counting from the next note up. You are not counting the gaps or the steps between the notes. You are counting the letter names themselves, and the count always begins at 1, right on your starting note. Get that habit in, count the first note as 1, and the number falls out every single time. Now here is the part that genuinely surprises a lot of beginners the first time they meet it. The sharps and flats in between do not change the number at all. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Take C up to E, count it. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, so that is a third. Good. Now take C up to E flat instead. We have lowered that top note by the tiniest amount, just 1 key down. But watch the letters. We still pass through the same names, C, D, and E. So it is still a third. The number did not budge, not even slightly, because we are still landing on an E, just a flattened one. And the same logic holds for all of them. A fifth stays a fifth whether the notes are natural, sharp, or flat. The accidentals nudge the pitch, but they leave the letter count untouched. So you might be thinking, if the number is that rough, if it cannot even tell C to E apart from C to E flat, then why do we bother with it at all? Here is why. The number gives you the size of the step, the broad shape of the distance at a glance. It instantly tells you that a third is bigger than a second and smaller than a fourth. It is the first half of the full answer. And later on, it pairs up with the exact distance to give an interval its complete name. Let us walk a few of these on the keyboard, one after another, until the counting starts to feel automatic, because the truth is that speed only ever comes from doing the representatives. We are going to keep it simple. Start on C every single time, and count up. First, C to D. 2 letters, C and D, so that is a second, the smallest step you can name with a number. Next, C to E. 3 letters, C, D, E, so that is a third, the warm, full sound that sits right at the heart of most chords. Now stretch a little further. C to G, count them, C, D, E, F, G, that is 5 letters, a fifth, the strong, open, hollow interval you hear absolutely everywhere in music. And finally, go all the way up to the next C, count it the whole way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 letters, and that interval is an octave, the very same letter name arriving again, only higher up. That is why 2 Cs sound like the same note in 2 places. Now run that little loop a few times on your own. Start on C, remember to count the first note as 1, and very soon you will name the number on sight, without consciously counting at all. That is the goal. The counting becomes invisible. So take a step back and look at what you can already do. Hand you any 2 notes on the keyboard, and you can name the size of the interval between them, just by counting the letter names and remembering to start your count at 1. That is real, solid ground, and it is more than a lot of people ever nail down. But you may have noticed something nagging at the back of your mind this whole time. We saw that C to E and C to E flat are both thirds. The number says they are the same size. And yet, if you actually listen to them, they clearly do not sound the same at all. One of them is bright and open. The other one is darker, sadder, more shadowed. The number alone simply cannot tell those 2 apart. So there has to be something more, some extra layer of information hiding inside that number. There is. That difference, that exact distance buried inside the rough size, is called quality. And quality is where intervals really come alive, where they get their emotion and their character. So next time, we are going to measure that precise distance, in tiny steps called semitones, and finally tell those 2 thirds apart once and for all.